There's a room in a climate-controlled vault outside Los Angeles that most people will never be allowed to enter. Inside it, on padded steel racks under UV-filtered light, hangs a wardrobe worth more than $100 million. Not because of the fabric, not because of the thread count, because every single piece in that room once belonged to a man who understood something almost nobody else in entertainment history ever figured out. That clothing could be a weapon, a myth, and a business empire all stitched into the same jacket. This is a walk through that vault. This is the real story of Michael Jackson's $100 million closet. The Dangerous Tour beaded battle jacket. When Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage for the Dangerous World Tour in 1992, the jacket he wore looked less like something a musician would put on and more like something a general would be buried in. Black wool base, hand-strung glass beads running in diagonal lines across the chest, silver epaulettes built up in layers so his shoulders looked nearly twice their natural width. It took a team of embroiderers working in shifts almost 3 weeks to finish a single jacket, because every bead had to be sewn by hand at an angle that would catch the stadium lighting rig without creating a glare that would blind the front rows. What most fans never clocked watching it on a low-resolution VHS tape is that the jacket was rebuilt at least 4 separate times across the 18-month tour. Sweat, stage fog machines, and the sheer physical violence of Jackson's choreography ate through the beating faster than anyone anticipated. Wardrobe assistants traveled with spare bead reels in their carry-on luggage because losing even a small section mid-tour meant the jacket photographed wrong on the big screens behind him. This wasn't vanity, it was quality control at a level most Fortune 500 companies don't apply to their own product lines. The jacket's silhouette borrowed from Prussian military tunics, but Jackson insisted the collar be cut an inch lower than historical accuracy would suggest, because a higher collar restricted his neck movement during the crotch grab spin that closed out jam. Function always won the argument against authenticity. A piece could look exactly like something out of a 19th century war museum, but if it stopped him from hitting a mark on beat 4, it went back to the workroom and got cut apart. One surviving example of this jacket sold at a specialty entertainment auction for well over $400,000. An auction house specialist noted that bidding interest spiked specifically because of the hand beating, since machine replication of that exact pattern has never successfully been reverse engineered. The original pattern pieces, it turns out, were destroyed after the tour ended, either intentionally or through simple loss in storage. Whichever it was, the jacket became functionally unrepeatable, which is exactly the kind of accidental scarcity that turns a stage costume into a museum object. The Pepsi jacket that caught fire. In January of 1984, during the filming of a Pepsi commercial at the Shrine Auditorium, a pyrotechnic effect ignited too close to Jackson's hair, and the sequined jacket he was wearing caught fire on his scalp and shoulder before the crew could react. The jacket itself, black with silver sequins running down both sleeves, ended up scorched along the collar and right shoulder seam, and Jackson suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns that required reconstructive surgery over the following months. What almost nobody remembers is what happened to that specific jacket afterward. It wasn't thrown away. It was cataloged, bagged, and quietly placed into storage, burn damage and all, because even in the immediate aftermath of a medical emergency, someone on the production team understood that the garment itself had just become a piece of history, whether anyone wanted it to or not, decades later. That same charred jacket surfaced at auction, and it sold for a sum that dwarfed the price of pristine, undamaged stage costumes from the same era. Collectors weren't paying for craftsmanship at that point. They were paying for proximity to a single, freakish, life-altering moment. There's something almost uncomfortable about that transaction if you sit with it for more than a few seconds. A jacket that represents genuine physical trauma became one of the most financially valuable objects in the entire Jackson wardrobe archive, worth more than jackets that took 3 weeks of hand-beating to construct. It says something blunt and a little unsettling about what collectors are actually purchasing when they buy celebrity memorabilia. They aren't just buying fabric. They're buying a fragment of a story the public already knows by heart, and the more dramatic the story, the higher the number on the paddle. The 1993 Grammy medal jacket. At the 1993 Grammy Awards, Jackson appeared in a stark white military jacket loaded down the front with gold medals, braided cord looping from the left shoulder to a button at the chest, in the exact style of a European field marshal's dress uniform. It was arguably the most literal interpretation of his monarch fantasy that he ever wore in a non-performance setting, because a red carpet doesn't require the same range of movement a stage does. The designers could go heavier, stiffer, more ornamental, because nobody expected him to spin or drop into a split in a photo line. The medals themselves weren't purely decorative props pulled from a costume warehouse. Several were custom-cast pieces designed to resemble actual military honors, deliberately vague enough to avoid impersonating any specific nation's decorations, but specific enough in their weight and shine to read as authentic under camera flash. That distinction mattered enormously to the design team. Jackson wanted the authority of a genuine uniform without the baggage of actually representing a real government or army. He wanted to borrow the visual grammar of power without answering to any of the politics attached to it. Photographs from that night show him standing almost perfectly still for long stretches, chin slightly lifted, letting the jacket do the talking. It's a different kind of performance than what he gave on a concert stage, quieter, more posed, closer to portraiture than choreography. And it worked precisely because the jacket was engineered for stillness. Every design decision, from the stiffness of the shoulder padding to the weight of the metals themselves, was built around the assumption that this particular garment's job was to be looked at, not danced in. The History Tour Gold Coronation Jacket. For the History World Tour that launched in 1996, Jackson's team produced a jacket so heavily embellished in gold thread and metallic applique that stagehands nicknamed it the Coronation Piece before it ever left the workroom. The color scheme leaned deliberately imperial, gold on ivory with a stiff standing collar that framed his jaw and forced his posture upright, even during slower ballad segments of the set. This jacket arrived at the tail end of an era where Jackson's public image had grown increasingly complicated, and the costume choice wasn't accidental. Insiders on the design team have described the history-era wardrobe as a deliberate doubling down on the mythology, an almost defiant insistence on the imagery of kingship at a moment when the narrative around him in the press had turned darker and more skeptical. Whatever was happening off stage, on stage, he was going to walk out looking like something carved from gold and untouchable. The physical construction reflected that intent. Structural boning was sewn into the jacket's interior lining to keep the silhouette rigid even under stage lighting and sweat, a technique more commonly associated with formal historical corsetry than pop concert wardrobe. It made the jacket heavier and hotter to wear, and Jackson reportedly required more frequent water and cooling breaks during numbers that featured it compared to lighter costume changes elsewhere in the set. He accepted that trade-off without complaint, because the visual payoff, an entire stadium looking up at a man who appeared literally cast in gold, was worth the physical cost to him. The Neverland wedding suit. When Jackson married Lisa Marie Presley in a private ceremony in the Dominican Republic in 1994, he wore a dark, understated suit that stood in almost jarring contrast to everything else in his public wardrobe at the time. No epaulettes, no crystal embellishment, no fedora, just a well-tailored, conservative black suit that could have belonged to any groom at any wedding anywhere in the world. That restraint was itself a statement, whether it was calculated or not. For a man whose entire public identity had been built on visual excess, choosing near-total plainness for one of the most personal moments of his life suggested a person trying, at least for one afternoon, to be seen as simply human rather than as a walking spectacle. Wedding photographers present that day noted how uncharacteristically relaxed his posture looked in the suit, shoulders down, hands loose at his sides, none of the rigid performance stance that defined nearly every other public photograph of him from that decade. The suit never entered the auction circuit the way his stage costumes eventually did, and that absence is notable in itself. Family members reportedly retained it privately rather than allowing it into the broader memorabilia market, treating it as something closer to a keepsake than a commodity. In a collection where nearly everything eventually gets appraised, cataloged, and sold, the wedding suit remains one of the rare pieces that stayed out of the ledger. A small, quiet exception inside a $100 million empire of fabric and myth. The socks, nobody talks about. Buried underneath every conversation about the glove, the jacket, and the fedora is a detail so small it barely registers. And yet it was non-negotiable to Jackson personally: the white socks. From Motown 25 onward, Jackson insisted on wearing plain white crew socks paired with black loafers, specifically because the contrast drew the audience's eye down to his footwork during fast sequences. Dark socks would have let his ankles blend into the stage floor. White socks turned his feet into a second spotlight. Wardrobe supervisors who worked multiple tours have described restocking dozens of identical pairs of the exact same sock brand before every leg of a tour, because Jackson could apparently tell the difference between slightly different shades of white under stage lighting and would reject a pair that didn't match his expectation. It sounds almost absurd written out like that, a global superstar rejecting socks over a barely perceptible shade difference, but it's consistent with everything else about how he approached wardrobe. Nothing was arbitrary. Every inch of visible fabric on his body during a performance had a job to do, and the sock's job was to make his feet impossible to ignore. That obsessive attention paid off in a way that's easy to underestimate now, decades removed from the original performances. Dance instructors and choreographers who studied his footwork on video have pointed out that the white sock choice functionally taught an entire generation of dancers to watch feet as closely as they watch hands, shifting how footwork itself gets filmed and framed in pop performance to this day. A seemingly minor sartorial decision ended up reshaping how movement gets captured on camera industry-wide. the gold-rimmed aviators. Offstage, away from the fedoras and military jackets, Jackson had a quieter signature accessory that rarely gets the same attention. A rotating collection of gold-rimmed aviator sunglasses, often worn with the lenses tinted just dark enough to obscure his eyes without fully hiding his face from cameras. Paparazzi photographs from the 1980s and 1990s show dozens of slightly different pairs, some rounder, some more angular, but nearly all sharing that same warm gold frame. Stylists close to Jackson have suggested the sunglasses served a purpose that had nothing to do with fashion trends and everything to do with control. Eyes are the single most revealing feature on a human face, the hardest thing to fully perform through, and Jackson understood that better than almost anyone in the public eye. Hiding behind tinted gold lenses let him walk through an airport or step out of a car without the exhausting labor of managing his facial expression for 100 camera flashes going off at once. The sunglasses weren't an accessory. They were armor for the one part of his image he couldn't fully choreograph. Several pairs from this collection eventually made their way into private collections and museum exhibitions, dedicated to his personal effects, valued not for craftsmanship, since they were largely off-the-shelf luxury eyewear rather than custom builds, but purely for provenance. A pair of gold aviators that once sat on Michael Jackson's face, verified through photographic matching against paparazzi archives, commands a price entirely disconnected from what the same physical object would be worth without that history attached to it. The Scream Silver Future Suit. For the 1995 Scream video, Jackson and his sister Janet appeared in a stark, monochrome sci-fi world, and his costume matched that vision with a structured silver-toned jacket and pants combination that leaned hard into a futuristic, almost spacecraft interior aesthetic rather than the historical military inspiration that defined most of his other iconic looks. Sharp, geometric panel lines replaced the ornate braiding of earlier eras. It was Jackson's wardrobe, imagining a version of authority that belonged to the future instead of the past. The costume required an entirely different construction approach than his beaded or leather pieces. Rigid, molded panels sat over a flexible base layer, built to catch the harsh, high-contrast black and white lighting of the video's set design without disappearing into shadow or blowing out into pure white glare. Costume technicians on the shoot have described extensive lighting tests specifically for this jacket alone, adjusting the finish from matte to semi-gloss multiple times before landing on a texture that read correctly on camera. What made the Scream wardrobe notable within the broader arc of Jackson's style evolution is how briefly it existed. Unlike the fedora or the crystal glove, which he returned to across decades, the silver future aesthetic appeared essentially once and was never revisited in that specific form. It stands almost as a sealed time capsule inside the larger collection, a costume built for a single specific creative statement about siblinghood, unity, and forward motion, never diluted by repetition the way some of his more famous pieces eventually were. The 30th anniversary special suit. In September of 2001, Jackson took the stage at Madison Square Garden for a career-spanning celebration concert, appearing in a deep burgundy suit jacket with subtle metallic threading that read as understated by his own historical standards, but would have counted as maximalist for almost any other performer of the era. It marked one of his final full-scale public performances, before a long stretch of reduced public appearances, and in hindsight, wardrobe historians have treated the suit as something of a closing statement. The color choice itself carried weight. Burgundy sat outside the black, white, red, and gold palette that had defined nearly every iconic Jackson look up to that point, suggesting either a deliberate attempt at reinvention or simply the natural drift of a 42-year-old performer's taste evolving alongside him. Either read is defensible, and the ambiguity is part of what makes the piece interesting to collectors and historians studying the full arc of his wardrobe choices rather than just the most famous highlights. Physically, the suit was built with far less structural reinforcement than his earlier stage costumes, a reflection of a set list that leaned more heavily on ballads and career retrospectives than the athletic choreography of his prime touring years. Less stress on the seams meant less need for internal boning or reinforced stitching, and the resulting garment moved more like ordinary formal wear than the engineered performance armor of the bad or dangerous eras. It's a small but telling detail. Even as the image stayed regal, the construction underneath was quietly adapting to a body that had spent 3 decades absorbing the physical toll of the exact choreography those earlier jackets were built to survive. The unfinished This Is It wardrobe. When Jackson began rehearsals for the This Is It concert residency in early 2009, an entirely new wave of costumes had already begun moving through his design team's workroom, pieces that would never see a public stage. Sketches and partially completed garments recovered after his death in June of that year revealed a wardrobe direction that blended elements from across his entire career, military structuring pulled from the Dangerous era, futuristic paneling reminiscent of the Scream suit, and an even more elaborate crystal application planned for at least 2 showpiece jackets. Costume designers who had been contracted for the residency later described the creative direction as the most ambitious wardrobe planning of Jackson's entire career, intended to function almost as a career retrospective told through fabric, with each set piece nodding visually to a specific album era while still feeling cohesive as a single unified show wardrobe. Fabric swatches, half-finished beading samples, and mannequin fittings, frozen mid-process, became some of the most poignant objects connected to the production once it was clear the shows would never happen. Several of these unfinished pieces eventually appeared in museum exhibitions dedicated to Jackson's legacy, displayed deliberately incomplete, with visible basting stitches and unattached embellishment left exactly as they were found. Curators made the choice not to complete or restore them, arguing that the unfinished state itself told a more honest story than a polished reconstruction ever could. Standing in front of a half-beaded jacket with pins still holding fabric panels in place carries a different emotional weight than looking at a pristine museum piece behind glass. It looks like work interrupted, because that's exactly what it was. The auction economy behind the $100 million. None of this wardrobe would carry the astronomical valuation it does today without the machinery of the auction and memorabilia market that built up around it in the years following Jackson's death. Specialty auction houses dedicated entire sale catalogs to his personal effects, and prices for verified stage-worn pieces climbed steadily as supply tightened and demand from serious collectors, museums, and even other celebrities intensified. Provenance became the single most important factor driving price, more important in many cases than the objective craftsmanship of the piece itself. A jacket photographed on his body during an actual performance, with matching stitching patterns and wear marks verified against video footage frame by frame, could sell for many multiples more than a nearly identical jacket built as a spare or a rehearsal double that never appeared on camera. Authentication specialists developed increasingly sophisticated methods to verify these details, cross-referencing fabric dye lots, bead placement patterns, and even the specific wear pattern left by his particular gait and dance movements. The cumulative effect of dozens of individual sales across multiple auction houses over more than a decade is what eventually produced the figure now casually attached to the entire collection when people describe it in the aggregate. It isn't one appraiser sitting down and assigning a single number to a warehouse of clothing. It's the sum of hundreds of individual bidding wars, each one driven by a collector convinced that owning a specific jacket meant owning a physical fragment of a cultural moment that can never be recreated. Add those numbers together across the full known catalog of surviving pieces, and the $100 million figure isn't hyperbole. It's closer to a conservative estimate. The brooches and belt buckles. Away from the jackets that dominate most retrospectives, Jackson's smaller accessories tell their own quieter story about how deliberately his image was engineered down to the smallest detail. Custom belt buckles, several cast in sterling silver and shaped into intricate crests that resembled royal heraldry more than anything sold in a standard costume shop, appeared consistently across multiple tours, often the only piece of a given outfit that carried over from one era's wardrobe into the next. Brooches served a similarly consistent role, small enough to seem incidental but chosen with the same intensity as every larger garment. Several featured intricate metalwork depicting crowns, eagles, or abstract military insignia, pinned deliberately at the left breast in a position that echoed the placement of real military decorations. On a jacket already loaded with embroidery and crystal work, a single well-placed brooch might seem redundant, but Jackson's design team treated these accents as essential punctuation, the final detail that separated an impressive costume from a genuinely convincing regal illusion. Collectors who specialize in Jackson memorabilia have noted that these smaller pieces, precisely because they're easy to overlook next to a full, crystal-encrusted jacket, sometimes represent the best value entry point into serious collecting. A verified brooch worn during a specific performance carries real provenance value at a fraction of what a full stage jacket commands, and for institutions building educational exhibits about his design philosophy, these small accessories often communicate the underlying obsessiveness of his approach, just as clearly as the showpiece garments do. The climate-controlled vault itself. Perhaps the least glamorous but most financially critical part of the entire $100 million closet is the infrastructure that keeps it from disintegrating. Textiles, especially heavily embellished ones loaded with metal thread, crystal adhesive, and delicate beading, degrade steadily under normal environmental conditions. Humidity swells fabric fibers and encourages mold. Direct light bleaches dye. Temperature swings cause metal embellishments to expand and contract in ways that eventually crack the thread holding them in place. Serious private collectors and the institutions that hold major pieces of the Jackson wardrobe now maintain them in specialized storage environments with tightly controlled humidity, UV-filtered lighting, and acid-free padding designed specifically for textile preservation. Garments are stored flat or on custom padded forms rather than hung on standard hangers, because the weight distribution of a heavily beaded jacket hanging from its shoulders for years can permanently distort its shape. Some of the most heavily embellished pieces, including several from the dangerous and history eras, require rotating storage schedules, brought out for limited exhibition periods and then returned to dark, climate-stable storage to slow further deterioration. This preservation effort isn't sentimental, it's financial. A jacket that degrades visibly loses auction value, sometimes dramatically, and the specialists who maintain these collections operate with the same seriousness a museum applies to a centuries-old painting. In a strange way, it's a final, unintentional validation of everything Jackson's original design team believed about the work they were doing. They weren't just building costumes for a few nights of touring. They were, whether they fully understood it at the time or not, building museum objects that would outlive the man who commissioned them by decades and require the same institutional care as a Rembrandt. The designers who never got proper credit behind every iconic jacket sits a small, largely uncredited team of pattern cutters, beaters, and metalworkers, whose names rarely appear in the documentaries and retrospectives built around Jackson's image. Many of these craftspeople worked exclusively or near exclusively on his wardrobe for years at a time, developing techniques specifically for his body, his choreography, and his aesthetic demands that they never applied to any other client because no other client asked for anything remotely similar. Several of these artisans have given rare interviews over the decades describing the working conditions inside Jackson's wardrobe department, painting a picture of relentless, exacting standards paired with genuine creative freedom once the basic parameters of a design were approved. Jackson reportedly rarely rejected a concept outright once he'd approved the initial sketch, trusting his team to solve the technical execution however they saw fit. But he would notice immediately if the finished piece deviated even slightly from what he'd originally envisioned, down to details as small as the exact curve of a shoulder seam. That combination, total creative trust paired with an almost forensic eye for the smallest deviation from his vision, produced an unusually loyal core team that stayed with him across multiple decades, even as fashion trends and his own public image shifted dramatically around them. Their relative anonymity outside dedicated fan and collector circles is one of the more overlooked injustices buried inside this story. The $100 million valuation attached to the closet belongs, in no small part, to hands the public never learned the names of. Influence on the generations that followed. It's difficult to find a major stadium-scale pop performer working today whose stage wardrobe doesn't carry at least a distant echo of what Jackson's team built across those decades. The idea that a costume should function as architecture, engineered specifically around a performer's individual choreography, rather than pulled generically from a stock costume house, has become close to standard practice for any artist operating at the highest level of live production. Designers who came up in the industry after Jackson's peak years have spoken openly about studying his wardrobe archive the way film students study specific directors, breaking down individual garments not for their surface appearance, but for the underlying engineering logic that made them survive the physical demands of a full concert. The specific technique of reinforcing high-stress seams before a tour, rather than repairing them reactively after damage occurs, something that sounds obvious in hindsight, was far less standardized across the industry before Jackson's team essentially proved its necessity through decades of nightly destruction and repair. Fashion houses far removed from concert stages have borrowed from the same well. Runway collections built around exaggerated militaristic silhouettes, broad structured shoulders, and heavy metallic embellishment routinely draw comparisons to Jackson's stage wardrobe, whether or not the designer explicitly credits him as an influence. The visual language his team built over 25 years didn't stay contained inside arenas and stadiums. It leaked steadily outward into the broader culture of performance and high fashion alike, until pieces of it became so normalized that most people encountering them today have no idea they're looking at the great-grandchildren of a jacket built for a single man's shoulders in a Los Angeles workroom decades ago, the final closet at Neverland. By the time Jackson's ownership of Neverland Ranch ended in the mid-2000s, the property had housed, at various points, one of the most extensive private wardrobe collections ever assembled by a single individual, spread across multiple storage rooms, rather than a single closet in any conventional sense. Inventory taken during the property's later transitions described row after row of custom-built garment racks, many holding pieces that had never been publicly photographed or identified, quiet artifacts of an internal, creative process that existed almost entirely outside the public eye. Some of these pieces were early-stage prototypes for looks that eventually became famous in a different, refined form. Others appear to have been one-off experiments that were tried once, rejected, and simply never revisited, existing now purely as evidence of creative paths not taken. Cataloging efforts undertaken after his death by estate representatives and archivists have described the sheer scale of the task as unlike anything typically encountered in celebrity estate management, closer in scope to processing the archive of a major fashion house than the closet of an individual performer. That distinction matters enormously to understanding why the collection is worth what it's worth today. Most performers, even extremely successful ones, accumulate stage wardrobe as a byproduct of their career. Jackson's team built wardrobe as a parallel creative discipline running alongside the music itself, generating a body of work substantial enough to fill museum retrospectives independent of any specific song or tour. The closet was never just storage for old costumes. It was, functionally, an entire second body of artistic output that happened to exist as fabric instead of sound. What the $100 million actually represents. Strip away the auction headlines and the museum exhibitions, and what the number really represents is something closer to a referendum on how thoroughly one performer's visual identity managed to embed itself into global culture. $100 million in aggregated wardrobe value doesn't happen because clothing is inherently precious. It happens because millions of people across multiple generations formed an emotional relationship with specific images: a single sparkling glove on a dark stage, a red leather jacket cutting through a horror movie set, a gold bodysuit standing frozen like a monument, and that emotional relationship never fully faded, even decades after the performances themselves ended. Every jacket in that climate-controlled vault is functioning, whether its current owner thinks about it this way or not, as a physical anchor for a memory that exists primarily in people's minds rather than in the fabric itself. Collectors aren't really purchasing thread and crystal. They're purchasing a tangible connection to a moment of cultural significance that would otherwise exist only as footage, a way of owning a piece of something that felt, at the time, larger than any single object could possibly hold. That's the real story behind the number, and it's a more interesting one than the price tag alone suggests. It's not really about how much a jacket is worth. It's about what it means that so many people, decades later, still want to stand close enough to one of these garments to feel, even briefly, like they're standing close to the moment it represents. $100 million is what happens when an entire culture refuses to let a handful of costumes simply become old clothes. If you made it this far through the vault, you already understand why this wardrobe outlived the tours it was built for. Every jacket in that room is still doing exactly what it was designed to do decades ago, making it impossible to look away. Which pieces do you think deserve their own deep dive next? Drop it in the comments, and subscribe if you want to keep walking through history one closet at a time.